Socialism in the Past by Igor Shafarevich. We may hope to evaluate socialism correctly if we can find the right scale by which to measure it. With this in mind, it is natural to step back from the perhaps too narrow frame of contemporaneity and to consider it in its wider historical context. This we shall do in relation to socialist states and to socialist teachings. Are socialist states specific to our era, or do they have precedents? There can be no doubt about the answer. Many centuries and even millennia ago, there existed societies which embodied much more fully and consistently the socialist tendencies which we observe in modern states. Two examples will suffice. 1. Mesopotamia in the 22nd and 21st centuries BC. Mesopotamia was one of the cradles of civilization, where the first states, known to historians, arose in the 4th millennium before Christ. They were formed on the basis of the large economies of separate temples, which collected large masses of peasants and craftsmen around them and developed an intensive agriculture based on irrigation. Toward the middle of the 3rd millennium, Mesopotamia broke up into small kingdoms, in which the basic economic units remained the separate temples. Then, the Akkadian king Sargon began the era when Mesopotamia was again united in a single state. I shall summarize some of the facts about the state which in the 22nd and 21st centuries united Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Elam. Its capital was Ur, and the whole period is called the era of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Archaeologists have found huge quantities of cuneiform tablets reflecting the economic life of the time. From these we know that the basis of the economy remained the temple units. But after the unification, they lost all their independence and became cells in a unified state economy. Their heads were appointed by the king. They submitted detailed accounts to the capital, and their work was reviewed by the king's inspectors. Groups of workers were often transported from one temple to another. Agricultural workers, men, women, and children, were divided into parties headed by overseers. They worked all the year round, moving from one field to another and receiving seed grain, tools, and draft animals from temple and state stores. Similarly, in groups under a commander, they used to go to the stores for their food. The family was not regarded as an economic unit. Provisions were issued not to the head of a family, but to each worker, or more often, to the commander. The documents relate separately to men, women, children, and orphans. Evidently, there was no question of being allowed even the use, let alone the ownership, of plots of land for this category of workers. The other groups of inhabitants fed themselves by cultivating the plots set aside for them. Thus, there were fields allocated to individuals, fields for craftsmen, and fields for shepherds. But these fields were worked by the same workers as the state lands, and the work was supervised by state officials. The towns contained state workshops, of which the biggest were in the capital, Ur. The workers received tools, raw materials, and half-finished products from the state. The products of the workshops went into the state warehouses. Craftsmen, like agricultural workers, were divided into parties under overseers. Provisions were issued to them by the state stores on the basis of lists. Agricultural workers and craftsmen figure in the accounts as workers of full strength, 2/3 strength, or 1/6 strength. On this depended the norms for their provisions. Work norms also existed which determined the scale of the workers' rations. The temples submitted lists of the dead, the sick, and of absentees, with reasons. Workers could be transferred from one field to another, from one workshop to another, sometimes from one town to another. Agricultural workers were sent to assist in the workshops, and craftsmen were sent to work in the fields or haul barges. The bondage of large classes of the population is highlighted by the numerous documents concerning fugitives. These documents name the fugitives and their relatives, and they concern not only barbers or the sons of shepherds, but also priests and their sons. This picture of the life of the workers opens with regular statements about the death rate for the removal of the dead from food lists. One document declares a 10% mortality among its workers, another 14%, yet another 28%. Mortality was particularly high among women and children, who were employed on the heaviest work, such as hauling. 2. The Empire of the Incas. This great empire, numbering several million inhabitants and covering the territory from present-day Chile to Ecuador, was conquered by Spain in the 16th century. The conquerors have left detailed descriptions, which give an excellent picture of the life which they could see or learn about from the natives. The descriptions depict the nature of the social system there so clearly that even in modern histories of this state, the headings very often use the term socialist. The Inca state did not know private ownership of the means of production. Most of its inhabitants hardly owned a thing. Money was unknown. Trade played no perceptible role in the economy. The basis of the economy, the land, belonged theoretically to the head of the state, the Inca. That is, it was state property, and the inhabitants had only the use of it. Members of the governing class, the Incas, owned some land only in the sense that they received the income from it. The cultivation of these lands was done by the peasants as a form of service to the state and was supervised by state officials. The peasant received for his use a plot of specified size and additional strips as his family grew. When the peasant died, all the land reverted to the state. There were two other large categories of land, that owned directly by the state and that owned by the temples. All the land was worked by detachments of peasants commanded and supervised by officials. Even the moment to begin work was indicated by a signal, which consisted of an official blowing a horn from a tower specially constructed for this purpose. Peasants also worked as craftsmen. They received raw materials from state officials and handed their products back to them. Peasants were also builders, and for this purpose they were organized into great work brigades of up to 20,000 men. Finally, the peasants were liable for military service. The whole life of the population was regulated by the state. For the Inca governing class, there existed only one field of activity: service in the military or civilian bureaucracy, for which they were trained in closed state schools. The details of their personal life were controlled by the state. For instance, an official of a given rank could have a prescribed number of wives and concubines, a set amount of gold and silver vessels, and so on. But the life of the peasant was, of course, much more regimented. All his activities were prescribed for each period of his life. Between the ages of 9 and 16, he was to be a shepherd. From 16 to 20, he had to serve in an Inca's house, and so on down to old age. Peasant girls could be sent by the officials to the Inca's houses as servants or concubines, and they supplied the material for the mass human sacrifices. Peasant marriages were arranged by an official once a year, according to lists prepared in advance. The peasants' diet, the size of their huts, and their utensils were all laid down. Special inspectors traveled about the country to ensure that the peasants observed all these prohibitions and kept working. The peasant received his clothing, a cape, from state stores, and in each province the cape was of a specified color and could not be dyed or altered. These measures, and the fact that each province prescribed a distinctive hairstyle, facilitated surveillance of the population. Peasants were forbidden to leave their village without the permission of the authorities. The bridges and town boundaries were guarded by checkpoints. This whole system was supported by a schedule of punishments elaborated with striking thoroughness. Almost always they amounted to the death penalty, which was executed in an extraordinary variety of ways. The condemned were thrown into ravines, stoned, hung by the hair or the feet, thrown into a cave with poisonous snakes. Sometimes, in addition to this, they were tortured before being killed, and afterward the body was not allowed to be buried. Instead, the bones were made into flutes, and skins used for drums. These two examples cannot be ignored as isolated paradoxes. One could quote many others. 150 years after the Spanish conquest of the Incas, for example, the Jesuits constructed in a remote part of Paraguay a society on analogous principles. Private ownership of the land did not exist. There was neither trade nor money, and the life of the Indians was just as strictly controlled by the authorities. The Old Kingdom of Egypt was close to the Mesopotamian states, both in time and because of its system. The pharaoh was considered the owner of all the land and gave it only for temporary use. The peasants were regarded as one of the products of the land and were always transferred with it. They had obligations of state service, digging canals, building pyramids, hauling barges, quarrying and transporting stone. In the state-owned enterprises, craftsmen and workers received tools and raw materials from the king's stores and gave their products back to them. The bureaucracy of scribes who managed these tasks is compared by Gordon Childe with the commissars of Soviet Russia. He writes, "Thus, about 3,000 years before Christ, an economic revolution not only secured for the Egyptian craftsman his means of subsistence and his raw material, but also created the conditions for literacy and learning and gave birth to the state. But the social and economic organization created in Egypt by Menes and his successors as revolutionaries was centralized and totalitarian." One could cite other examples of societies whose life was to a significant degree based on socialist principles. But the ones that we have already indicated show sufficiently clearly that the emergence of socialist states is not the privilege of any specific era or continent. It seems that this was the form in which the state arose. The world's first socialist states were the world's first states of any kind. If we turn to socialist doctrine, we see a similar picture here too. These teachings did not arise either in the 20th century or the 19th. They are more than 2,000 years old. Their history can be divided into three periods. 1. Socialist ideas were well known in antiquity. The first socialist system, whose influence can be seen in all its countless variations right up to the present, was created by Plato. Through Platonism, socialist ideas penetrated to the Gnostic sects, which surrounded early Christianity, and also to Manichaeanism. In this period, the ideas of socialism were propagated in schools of philosophy and in narrow mystical circles. 2. In the Middle Ages, socialist ideas found their way to the masses. In a religious guise, they were propagated within various heretical movements. The Catharists, the Brethren of the Free Spirit, the Apostolic Brethren, and the Beghards. They inspired several powerful popular movements. For example, the Patarines of 14th century Italy, or the Czech Taborites of the 15th century. Their influence was particularly strong during the Reformation, and their traces can still be seen in the English Revolution in the 17th century. 3. Beginning with the 16th century, socialist ideology took a new direction. It threw off its mystical and religious form and based itself on a materialistic and rationalist view of the world. Typical of this was a militantly hostile attitude to religion. The spheres in which socialist ideas were propagated changed yet again. The preachers, who had addressed themselves to craftsmen and peasants, were replaced by philosophers and writers who strove to influence the reading public and the higher strata of society. This movement came to its peak in the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. At the end of that century, a new objective made itself felt, that of bringing socialism out of the salons, out of the philosopher's study, and into the suburbs, onto the streets. There followed a renewed attempt to put socialist ideas behind a mass movement. In this writer's opinion, neither the 19th nor the 20th century introduced anything that was new in principle into the development of socialist ideology. Let us cite a few illustrations to give an idea of the nature of socialist teachings and to draw attention to certain features, which will be important in the discussion to follow. 1. Plato's Republic depicts an ideal social system. In Plato's state, power belongs to the philosophers, who govern the country with the help of warriors, also called guardians. Plato's main concern was with the way of life of these guardians, since not only were the philosophers to be chosen from among them, but they were also to control the rest of the population. He wanted to subordinate their life completely to the interests of the state, and to organize it so as to exclude the possibility of a split and the emergence of conflicting interests. The first means of achieving this aim was the abolition of private property. The guardians were to own nothing but their own bodies. Their dwellings could be entered by anybody who wished to. They were to live in the Republic like hired laborers, serving only in return for food and no other reward. For the same purpose, the individual family was also abolished. All the men and women in the guardian class were to share their mates with all the others. Instead of marriage, there was to be brief, state-controlled sexual union for the purpose of physical satisfaction and the production of perfect progeny. To this end, the philosophers were to yield to distinguished guardians the right of more frequent sexual union with the more beautiful women. Children, from the moment of birth, would not know their own fathers or even mothers. They were to be cared for communally by all the women who happened to be lactating, and the children passed around all the time, and the state would take care of their subsequent upbringing. At the same time, a special role was assigned to art, which was to be purged mercilessly in the name of the same goals. The more perfect it was from the aesthetic point of view. The fables of Hesiod and Homer were to be destroyed, and most of classical literature with them. Everything that might suggest the idea that the gods were imperfect and unjust, that might induce fear or gloom, or could inculcate disrespect for the authorities. New myths were to be invented, on the other hand, to develop in the guardians the necessary civic virtues. Apart from this ideological supervision, the life of the guardians was to be biologically controlled as well. This control began with the careful selection of parents able to provide the best progeny, and selection was based on the achievements of agriculture. Children of unions not sanctioned by the state, like those with physical imperfections, were to be destroyed. The selection of adults was to be entrusted to medicine. Doctors would treat some patients, allow others to die, and kill the remainder. 2. The philosophy of the medieval heretics was based on the opposition between the spiritual and the material worlds, as two antagonistic and mutually exclusive categories. It begot hostility toward the whole material world, and in particular to all forms of social life. All these movements rejected military service, oaths, or litigation, personal submission to ecclesiastical and secular authority, and some rejected marriage and property. Some movements considered only marriage as sin, but not adultery, so that this demand did not have an aesthetic character, but aimed at the destruction of the family. Many sects were accused by their contemporaries of free or sacred love. One contemporary states, for instance, that the heretics considered that marital ties contradict the laws of nature, since these laws demand that everything should be held in common. In precisely the same way, the denial of private property was linked with its renunciation in favor of the sect, and the common ownership of property was fostered as an ideal. In order to make their teaching more attractive, they introduced common ownership, according to the record of one 13th century trial of some heretics. These more radical aspects of the doctrine were usually communicated only to the elite of the sect, the perfected, who were sharply set apart from the basic mass of believers. But in times of social crisis, the preachers and apostles of the sect used to take their socialist ideas to the masses. As a rule, these ideas were mingled with calls for the destruction of the whole existing order, and above all, of the Catholic Church. Thus, at the beginning of the 13th century in Italy, the Paterine movement, led by preachers from the sect of the Apostolic Brethren, provoked a bloody 3-year war. The Apostolic Brethren taught that, in love, everything must be held in common, property and wives. Those who joined the sect had to hand all their property over for common use. They thought of the Catholic Church as the whore of Babylon, and the Pope as Antichrist, and they called for the murder of the Pope, bishops, priests, monks, and all of the godless. Any action against the enemies of the true faith was proclaimed to be permissible. A little over 100 years later, heretical sects dominated the Taborite movement, whose raids terrorized Central Europe for a quarter of a century. Of them, a contemporary says, "In the citadel or Tabor, there is no mine or thine. Everybody uses everything equally. All must hold everything in common, and nobody must have anything separately, and he who does is a sinner." Their preachers taught, everything, including wives, must be held in common. The sons and daughters of God will be free, and there will be no marriage as a union of just two, man and wife. All institutions and human decisions must be abolished, since none of them was created by the Heavenly Father. The priests' houses and all church property must be destroyed. Churches, altars, and monasteries must be demolished. All those who have been elevated and given power must be bent like the twigs of trees and cut down, burned in the stove like straw, leaving not a root nor a shoot. They must be ground like sheaves. The blood must be drained from them. They must be killed by scorpions, snakes, and wild animals. They must be put to death. The great specialists on the history of the heresies, I. von Dollinger, describes their social principles as follows. Every heretical movement that appeared in the Middle Ages possessed, openly or secretly, a revolutionary character. In other words, if it had come to power, it would have to destroy the existing social order and produce a political and social revolution. These Gnostic sects, the Catharists and Albigensians, whose activities evoked severe and implacable legislation against heresy and were bloodily opposed, were socialists and communists. They attacked marriage, the family, and property. These features appeared still more clearly in the heretical movements after the Reformation, in the 16th century. We shall adduce one example, the teaching of Nicholas Storch, leader of the so-called Zwickau prophets. This teaching, as described in a contemporary book, included the following propositions. 1. No marital connection, whether secret or open, is to be observed. 2. On the contrary, any man can take wives when the flesh demands it, and his passions rise, and live with them in bodily intimacy exactly as he pleases. 3. Everything is to be held in common, since God sent all peoples into the world equal. Similarly, he gave equally to all the possessions of the earth, of the fowl in the air and the fish in the sea. 4. Therefore, all authorities, terrestrial and spiritual, must be dismissed once and for all, or to be put to the sword, for they live untrammeled, they drink the blood and sweat of their poor subjects, they guzzle and drink night and day. So we must all arise, the sooner the better, arm ourselves and fall upon the priests in their cozy little nests, massacre them and wipe them out, for if you deprive the sheep of their leader, you can do what you like with them. Then we must fall upon the bloodsuckers, seize their houses, loot their property, raze their castles to the ground. 3. In 1516 appeared the book which started a new stage in the development of socialist thought, Thomas More's Utopia. Being in the form of a description of an ideal state built on socialist principles, it continued, after a 2,000-year break, the tradition of Plato, but in the completely different conditions of Western Europe of the Renaissance. The most significant works to follow in this new current were The City of the Sun by the Italian monk Tommaso Campanella, 1602, and The Law of Freedom in a Platform by his contemporary in the English Revolution, Gerard Winstanley, 1652. From the end of the 17th century and in the 18th, socialist views spread more and more widely among writers and philosophers, and there appeared a veritable torrent of socialist literature. The socialist novel came into being, in which descriptions of socialist states were intertwined with romance, travel, and adventure. For example, the history of the Savarambi by Verres, the Republic of Philosophers by Fontenelle, the Southern Discovery by Rétif de la Bretonne. The number of new philosophical, sociological, and moral tracts preaching socialist views constantly increased. For example, Messlier's Testament, The Law of Nature by Morley, Thoughts on the Condition of Nature by Mabley, The True System by Deschamps, and passages in Diderot's supplement to The Journey of Bougainville. All these works agree in proclaiming as a basic principle the common ownership of property. Most of them supplement it with compulsory labor and bureaucratic rule. More, Campanella, Winstanley, Verres, Morley. Others depict a country divided into small agricultural communes, ruled by their most experienced members or by old men. Meslier, Deschamps. Many systems presuppose the existence of slavery. More, Winstanley, Verres, Fenelon, and More and Winstanley regard it not only as an economic category but as a means of punishment, upholding the stability of society. They offer frequent elaborations of the ways in which society will subordinate the individuality of its members. Thus, More speaks for a system of passes, which would be essential not only for journeys about the country but for walks outside the town, and he prescribes identical clothing and housing for everybody. Campanella has the inhabitants going about in platoons, and the greatest crime for a woman is to lengthen her dress or paint her face. Morley forbids all thought on social or moral subjects. Deschamps assumes that all culture, art, science, and even literary, will wither away spontaneously. An important part is played in these works by consideration of the way in which the family and sexual relations are to change. Campanella, Rétif, Diderot, Deschamps. Campanella assumes absolute bureaucratic control in this domain. Bureaucrats decide which man is to couple with which woman and when. The union itself is supervised by officials. Children are reared by the state. Deschamps thinks that the menfolk of a village will be the husbands of all the women, and that the children will never know their parents. A new view of human history was worked out. Medieval mysticism had regarded it as a unified process in the revelation of God in 3 stages. Now this was transformed into the idea of a historical process subject to immanent laws and likewise consisting of 3 stages, the last of which leads inescapably to the triumph of the socialist ideal, e.g., Morelli, Deschamps. Unlike the medieval heresies, which had attacked only the Catholic religion, the socialist view now became hostile to any religion, and socialism fused with atheism. In More, freedom of conscience is linked with the recognition of pleasure as the highest objective in life. Campanella's religion resembles a pantheistic deification of the cosmos. Winstanley's attitude to religion is one of outright hostility. His priests are merely the agitators and propagandists of the system he describes. Deschamps considers that religion will wither away, together with the rest of culture. But Meslier's Testament stands out for its aggressive attitude towards religion. In religion, he sees the root of mankind's misfortunes. He considers it a patent absurdity, a malignant superstition. He particularly loathes the person of Christ, whom he showers with abuse in protracted tirades, even blaming him because he was always poor and he wasn't resourceful enough. The very end of the 18th century saw the first attempt to put the socialist ideology, which had been developed, into practice. In 1786, in Paris, a secret society called the Union of the Equal was founded with the aim of preparing a revolution. The plot was discovered and its participants arrested, but their plans have been preserved in detail, thanks to the documents published by the government and to the memoirs of the plotters who survived. Among the aims which the plotters had set themselves, the first was the abolition of private property. The whole French economy was to be fully centralized. Trade was to be suspended and replaced by a system of state provisioning. All aspects of life were to be controlled by a bureaucracy. The fatherland takes possession of a man from the day of his birth and does not let him go until his very death. Every man was to be regarded to some extent as an official supervising both his own behavior and that of others. Everybody was to be obliged to work for the state, while the uncooperative, the negligent, and people who lead dissolute lives or set a bad example by their absence of public spirit were to be condemned to forced labor. For this purpose, many islands were to be turned into strictly isolated places of confinement. Everybody was to be obliged to eat in communal refectories. Moving about the country without official permission was to be forbidden. Entertainments, which were not available to everybody, were categorically forbidden. Censorship was to be introduced, and publications of a falsely denunciatory character were forbidden.